Hey everybody, this is Perch, and I'm joined by Joe Corallo. How you doing, Joe?
Oh, I'm all right, Perch. How are you?
I'm doing great, and we've got a very special guest. We're talking to Glenn Greenberg, and we're going to get into kind of all the things that you did, and pretty much an amazing look at kind of this industry and everywhere it went. Glenn, how are you doing?
I am doing okay through this very difficult and challenging time period. But knock on wood and thank the Maker. My family and I have been getting through it relatively well.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it's a weird time for everybody in this industry. Certainly, the industry that was already going through a lot of changes. It certainly did not help. But I'm glad you and your wife are doing well.
Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, it certainly accelerated some things that I think probably were inevitable for the industry. But sad to see it happening anyway. Certainly with regards to stores and what's going on at DC Comics. Very sad to see what's going on there, and hope they can right that ship.
We're talking about how they took the trunks away from Superman, right?
Exactly.
Well, that's what got me to stop reading DC Comics. But I was coming back because the shorts were back. You know, the red trunks were back.
Yeah.
So they pulled me back into it. But unfortunately, no, it's a lot of the stuff on the business end. I'm sad to see.
Yeah.
It's tough. Like I said, it's a lot of change, and I'm with you. I think it was inevitable that we were going to go through this, but it seemed to accelerate it perhaps much faster than people were really prepared to.
Yeah. I think with AT&T taking over DC Comics, and Warner Brothers too.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed pretty early on that they didn't have any real long-term commitment to publishing comic books, that they were kind of wondering why they were in the comic book business to begin with. And that sent a pretty, ominous signal, that I think had COVID-19 not happened, I think it would have been a much more long and drawn out process. I think what this pandemic did was just, bring them to conclusions that they probably would have come to otherwise. It just would have taken longer time.
Yeah.
But certainly, I think there was going to be a change in leadership, no matter what. And I was hoping that was going to be for the best.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say. I wish Marie Javins all the best in the world. I worked with her when I was at Marvel. I hope they give her the opportunity to show what she can do.
Yeah, I do too. I think she's very, very smart and very clever, very savvy. And it will depend on how much she's able to actually do the job they have her doing. So
exactly, yeah.
It's always tough when a corporation. I mean, Marvel went through this. Well, so we'll get into all this with you, but definitely, when a company that is a large multi-conglomerate like that comes in and buys a comic company or owns it, finds that they owned it, it's different for them. It's a different type of property, and it's got to be very jarring for the people inside of it.
Yeah. I would imagine so. When Marvel merged with Toy Biz, I wasn't there long enough to really see the shift. I didn't stick around. What I mean to say is I didn't stick around long enough to really see the shift. I heard horror stories after I left because I stayed in touch with a lot of people. But the corporate culture and the changing of the way things were done and all of that, I left maybe like a month or two after the merger was approved. But I've certainly experienced in other companies that I've worked at, major shifts in how business is done, major shifts in the culture. I have to imagine that it was a real like a splash of cold water in the face at DC. Once AT&T took over. It's inevitable, and if you don't have corporate owners who really value what you do, It's a bad situation to be in. I think one of the great things about Disney buying Marvel is that, I think Kevin Feige really gets it. And I think he really values the comic books as a source of ideas, and as a source of creative inspiration. And I think that, that Disney has done really, really well by Marvel, at the very least up on the big screen. The movies have been terrific. Some better than others, but the movies have been terrific. I almost wish that, the same kind of TLC could be given to the comic books. I look at the comics and I wish that the tender loving care and the craftsmanship and the skill that I'm seeing in the movies could sort of work its way back into the comic books. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah. How did you end up finding yourself at Marvel, and what kind of comics were you into before you got there?
Before I got there, the comic books that I loved the most were, I grew up, the first comic books that I read were Batman. Probably the first character I discovered was Batman through the TV show, the Adam West TV show. This would have been the early 70s. And then I was poking around in my brother's closet. He was off at college probably. And I found some Batman comic books, that he'd left behind. And I was like, oh, wow, Batman is in comic books too? And so that's where it really began. Shortly after that was the Hulk. And probably after that was Spider-Man. And so I started discovering, those characters. And those were the ones that, for the most part, I read consistently. I became a huge fan of Marvel's Star Wars comic book.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
I came in right at the tail end of the Archie Goodwin, Carmine Infantino era.
Oh, nice.
So when David Michelinie and Walter Simonson and Tom Palmer took over, I was like, wow, it really blew my mind, because I was enjoying what Archie and Carmine were doing, but boy, the stuff that Michelinie and Simonson and Palmer did was just incredible. Tomb of Dracula, I discovered around that same period. And I would say, the first Superman movie really just struck me with, wow, that's what Superman could be. And that's not what I was seeing in the comic books at the time. So I was never a big Superman fan as a kid.
Yeah.
When John Byrne came in and did The Man of Steel, that's the Superman I wanted to see. And that made me a regular, faithful Superman reader for the next 10, 15 years. Because what I saw on the big screen, that's what I wanted that's how I wanted Superman portrayed as. So, I certainly, I read Watchmen, I read Crisis on Infinite Earths, I read Secret Wars, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So in terms of my career, how I got into comics, it was a very interesting way, I think. I was going for law in college. My first 3 years in college, I was planning on going for law. And I got through the second half of my senior year, and I decided I don't want to be a lawyer. And I was like, if I put a gun to my head, what would I want to be if I could choose anything I'd want to be? And I was like, I either want to be a filmmaker or I want to be a comic book creator. Yeah. And nice. I was working on a convention at my school, my school, which was SUNY at Stony Brook. Which is now known as Stony Brook University. They ran a convention every year called Icon, and I was invited to be the comics coordinator. So I put together the whole comics track, and that put me in touch with all these people at Marvel in DC. And, I started working those connections. And then I remembered that I'd known since I was about 12 years old, Bob Budiansky, who was a friend of a family friend. Yes. So 2 steps removed, but I'd met him as a boy. He had given me a tour of the Marvel offices when I was, around 1982, when I was about 12. And I got back in touch with him, and I said, look, this is what I want to do with my life. What would you advise? And he gave me some advice, and he said, look, I'm looking for an assistant right now. He said, but you'd have to drop out of school He says, I know it's March or April. You'd have to miss your last couple of months of your senior year because I need somebody right now. And I said, my mother and father would kill me. So I had to pass up the opportunity, but I stayed in touch with him. I got a job in publishing after graduation. I was in book publishing, and I spent the next year working every connection I possibly could. Denny O'Neil, Bob Budiansky, Don Daly, who was the editor of The Punisher at the time.
Wow.
Nell Yumtov, who was the editor of I think West Coast Avengers at the time, and Darkhawk, and all of these connections. I just kept staying in touch with them, and ultimately, about a year later, Bob Budiansky, I lined up some freelance at Marvel. I was writing and editing. I wasn't writing, but I was editing and selecting the letters for various letters pages. I was doing the letters pages for Darkhawk, and one other book. I can't remember what it was, but Darkhawk is where it began, and that led me to take on some other letters pages. And I was up at Marvel, just dropping off the latest letters page, probably for Darkhawk, and Bob Budiansky saw me in the hallway. He goes, "I want to talk to you," and I was like, "Okay," and went into his office, and he said, "I need another assistant. Are you interested?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I interviewed with him, and I got it. Almost to a year to the day when I first started talking to him, and I became his assistant. And that's how it all began. And what the early projects that I worked on, which I was in the special projects department. The first project that I worked on was the Marvel Masterpieces trading card set painted by Joe Jusko.
Yep.
Where he painted the entire set. And that was the first project that I worked on. And eventually I managed to work my way into the actual comic books, working directly under Tom Brevoort, who is still at Marvel.
Yes.
But both Tom and I worked under Bob Budiansky. And that's how it began. It was a combination of, persistence and knowing the right people. And I was very lucky to know the right people.
Nice.
And a lot of factors just fell into play. I was helped a lot by the fact that I worked on that convention at Stony Brook and managed to invite these people to the campus, to the convention, and formed these relationships that I was able to use as a stepping stone. And I'm still friends with a lot of these people.
Nice.
Yeah. So, that's some good classic networking right there, and persistence to get. And
yeah.
When would this have been? What year would this have been?
I met all these people in 91, and I started working at Marvel in 92.
Right. Because the Joe Jusko cards were in 92.
Yeah. That was. I started on July 6th, 1992, and that was the first project that I was working on, and immediately knee deep in it. Yeah.
Well, and that was a fascinating time at Marvel, because Marvel was about to go through some pretty just dramatic changes.
Not for the first few years. When I got there, we were in the middle of a boom period.
It was booming at that point.
Oh, I see.
Hugely successful.
When I hear people talk about the changes, I always think about the bad part.
Right.
Do
that. Yeah.
we had expanded to a really extensive degree. The editorial staff was probably the largest it had ever been. We were getting bonuses like you would not believe. That's how well we were doing at the time. This was in the wake of. Now, keep in mind, when I got there, Image had already formed. So McFarlane and Liefeld and Jim Lee, all those guys were gone already. But we weren't hurt that much by their departure and the formation of Image. We were still doing gangbusters.
Right.
The problem was the speculator market, where we were doing all those multiple versions of covers and putting out a lot of number ones, and the speculators thought that they could send their kids to college on buying all these comic books that within a year they found out there were so many of these comics in existence, they weren't rare, so they weren't going to be worth anything. Yeah. And that's what started the slow collapse. But when I got there, Marvel was the most fun place in the world to be. It was really like being back in college. And we were just, we were creative. We were allowed to be creative. It was a very, very loose, not corporate atmosphere. Tom DeFalco was the editor-in-chief, and although I don't know if he liked to scare the assistants, but we were all very scared of him. You know, he was like this towering presence that, you know, and he always had like this very serious look on his face, like, you know, what are you laughing at, or, you know, what are you looking at, kind of thing. I always got the impression that maybe, just maybe, he was laughing on the inside, you know, knowing that he was making us nervous. Tom and I are very, very good pals now, but at the time I was petrified of him. But aside from that, it was a great environment. It was a great place to work, and I would say for the first 3 years that I was there, it was like that. And then the business just changed. I mean, you know, the collapse of the speculator market, the collapse of the direct market, all those comic book stores that started going out of business, which was precipitated by Marvel buying Heroes World and doing, you know, deciding to do its own distribution. That really hurt the industry as a whole. I mean, it gets so monotonous with the business end of things. I mean, I don't know how interested, you know, you guys are in that. I'm not, but, except in the fact that, you know, it really affected my job. Mm-hmm. But you know, the industry was hurt by some bad business decisions made by people who were not in the comic book industry because they had any love for comics. I'm talking about Ron Perlman when he bought Marvel in 88, 89, I think it was. Mm-hmm. You know, he wasn't, I don't know how much of the long term he was in it for, but a lot of the business decisions he made were very destructive to the comic book industry. And I know that the Marvel execs were warned. I don't know how high up those warnings went, but we in editorial saw the writing on the wall. We knew that Marvel buying Heroes World was going to be really, really damaging to the industry overall. But I don't know if that ever reached Perlman's ears or even the president's ears. And if it did reach the president's ears, I don't know if there's much he could have done about it. You know, I mean, that's the direction they were going in. So, yeah. Anyway.
I'm actually curious. So, by the way, I think many people will be fascinated because there's so many stories that about this time period and what happened, and it's almost become this kind of almost urban legend, tribal myth kind of era. That is, I you know, when talking to people like yourself, it's you get a different story of what was going on, mm-hmm. And a more an accurate story of what was going on. I was running a comic store during this period, so I always wince when people tell me, you know, hey, there's no better era than the '90s. It's like, well. That's not quite was my experience, but how you said it was more like like being in a college, like having this kind of light atmosphere. You're able to creatively do what you wanted to do, but still, I mean, with the goal was business, right? The goal was to continue to expand and grow, and it wasn't like a free for all. Or no. I mean, we had adults in place in the right positions. You know, Tom DeFalco was a great editor-in-chief, and he had a steady hand, and you always knew that he was the guy in charge. You know, my boss or my boss's boss, Bob Budiansky, very serious, you know, mature guy who knew what his job was, did it really, really, really well. No, I mean, the adults were in charge. It wasn't like a free for all, but it wasn't like the kind of stifling corporate, you know, environment where, you know, everything was so rigid and so structured, and you had to follow a formula and that kind of thing. We were trying different things. We were trying different ideas. You know, we were making some daring moves, you know, at the time. I mean, looking back, I mean, you know, what was going on with, like, say, Daredevil, where they gave Daredevil this new suit of armor, and they brought back Elektra, which at the time was pretty daring because, you know, we all knew Frank Miller was opposed to it unless he was writing it. Mm-hmm.
The Hulk was doing really innovative stuff under Peter David.
Yeah.
I mean, Spider-Man, they were doing some interesting things. Under J.M. DeMatteis writing it. I mean, right there. I mean, the stuff with, oh my God, the stuff with Harry Osborne that J.M. DeMatteis was writing. That's some of the best Spider-Man stuff that was ever done. I reread it recently for an article that I wrote for Back Issue Magazine. I reread the whole DeMatteis run with Harry Osborne becoming the Green Goblin again. That stuff was brilliant, and that was all during that time.
Yeah, those books hold up great. So you're basically telling me it's possible to have a mature, steady business and creative freedom at the same time.
Yeah,
amazing.
It is. I mean, it certainly was. It was a very unique place to work, and I don't think any other place in the world is like what Marvel was. I would say from 92 to 96.
Yeah.
That period was just even though that was the period. 95 was when the dam started to burst, but still the team that was in place, they were great people, just great creative professional people who knew their jobs and tended to do it well.
Yeah. And one of those people was, Mark Gruenwald, who you worked with. We're coming up on both the 80th anniversary of Cap next month, which is one of the things he's most well known for. And, unfortunately, the 25th anniversary of his passing this summer. Mm-hmm. Would you be able to talk a bit about your experiences with working with Mark?
Absolutely. Mark was a very quiet guy, and a very kind of, I don't think he meant to be standoffish, but he came off as standoffish if you didn't know him. So in my early days there, I didn't know what to make of Mark. I actually felt a little nervous around Mark because I didn't know, what to make of him because he was so reserved. And he certainly saw that he had friends, and he was more open and casual with his friends, but I wasn't one of them. So I just, it was that kind of thing. But Mark was a mentor to all of the assistant editors. Every week he would hold once a week assistant editors class where he was like the professor, and he had a whole year-long curriculum worked out. And each week we would go through further into that curriculum, and he would teach us the mechanics of storytelling and of editing and character dynamics and theme and all of that kind of stuff. So he wasn't just the executive editor; he was our teacher. And as Marvel contracted, I mean, it was a terrible thing that the company got smaller and smaller every year. Once we headed into the bad times, but as the staff got smaller, and I managed to survive the layoffs and and that kind of thing, it forces you to get to know your colleagues better, because there are fewer of you, so you're stuck in the same room and you start to interact more. And Mark and I got closer, and he became a real mentor to me. Now, Mark was a practical joker, and Mark was a very sort of a quietly funny guy. He took it upon himself to try to keep up morale when things started to get bad. So he would go in, early in the morning or late at night and redecorate the offices, usually at the expense of Ralph Macchio, who was, one of the other senior editors there at the time. There was one time where he just took a photograph of Ralph and just Xerox hundreds of copies and put Ralph's face all over the walls. I mean, just on all of the posters had Ralph's face on it. It was silly, but it was funny.
That made its way out, I remember, to the outside, and it was one of those. It gave you the impression, if you were on the outside, that it was a company that knew kind of how to make fun of itself, and it seemed like a cheerful place to be. Absolutely.
And Mark was a big part of that. And Mark became, and it was one of those things where it's sort of this was 3 or 4 years in for my time there. And it's sort of oh my God, I've got this friend that, I've had all along and I never knew, I never knew it. And it was when I started doing some writing for Mark, and I pitched a story that was this is going deep in the weeds, but I pitched a story that was very, very loosely based. It was a Silver Surfer story, and it was very, very loosely based on a never completed rock opera by Pete Townsend that he was going to do with the Who.
Nice.
And it never happened, and the remnants of it became the Who's next album, which is probably their greatest album. So some of the songs that Townsend had written for this rock opera ended up on Who's Next, but the rock opera itself never came together.
Huh.
So I pitched this story to Gruenwald, and I meet with him in his office, and he's kind of looking at me with like this. He always had this kind of smirk on his face, you know. It was like the wheels were always turning, and you never knew what was going on in his head. And he said to me, he says, you wouldn't have happened to have heard of Lifehouse by Pete Townsend, would you? And my jaw dropped. I'm like, yeah. He goes, okay. He goes, I know where you're coming from on this. And he bought the story, you know. And the fact that he knew about this never completed project meant this guy knew what he was talking about. This guy was well versed, you know. And then I found out he was a huge Beatles fan, and we traded Beatles bootlegs together. You know, he gave me some of his, I gave him some of mine, and you know, that kind of stuff. And he just knew all of this stuff. He was so knowledgeable about so many different things. And the quintessential Mark Gruenwald story for me is, I told you that he was our teacher, and that we would have class with him every week. One of the things that Mark said in one of his classes was, you know, when you are writing a story for a Marvel character, that story has to be designed for that Marvel character. So if you write a Daredevil story, Daredevil should be the only character that story can, you know, be about. You can't, if you've written a Daredevil story and it gets rejected, and you just erase all the Daredevils and you put in Captain America instead, you haven't written a Daredevil story. Okay? Yeah. So that was one of the lessons that he really instilled in us.
That's a good lesson.
Yeah.
So fast forward about maybe 8 months later, and again, I'm starting to pitch stuff to Mark's office because Mark was editing books again, and I pitch him another Silver Surfer story, and he says, I like it. He says, I don't have any room for it in Silver Surfer right now because I'm booked solid. He said, but I've got this other thing coming up. He said, if you turned it into a Fire Lord story, I can use it there. And I looked at him like my jaw dropped, and I opened my mouth to say something, and Mark said, I know. I said, if it's going to be a Silver Surfer story, it has to be a Silver Surfer. Because I know, but do you want to sell the story or not? So I went home and I changed all the Silver Surfers to Fire Lord, and I sold it to him. But that was Mark.
I mean, so many good stories about Mark over the years. Just the fact that he did try and do this class and mentor people coming up, it feels like maybe that's something we've kind of lost today. Is there somebody who's fulfilling that role these days? Do you know?
I hope so. If there is, I hope it's Tom Brevoort. I don't know for sure. I don't know what the day-to-day stuff is at Marvel today. I hope so. I hope somebody's doing that because you need it. You just do. I mean, I see a lot of craftsmanship that isn't there that should be, and I hope that if they're not doing it, I hope they start doing it soon. And I really hope that Brevoort is the one to do it because
he's to do it. He's the one in the role.
Yeah.
He'd have the credibility to come and do it. It is. I can imagine with the way the business works now, and also some of the decentralization has taken place. It's probably. I mean, the culture is probably just different. But I think if they aren't doing it, they've lost quite a bit because I can imagine that's got to be really critical to get new people in.
Yeah. And the thing is Mark gave those classes every week, and I look back at the '90s stuff, and there was a lot we didn't get right. Sure. I think that when I look back, there was well, I think part of it is, we had to acknowledge the Image influence.
Mhm.
At that point, style was taking precedence over substance.
Right.
And there were some great books that Marvel put out during that period, and there were some great writers that we had. I mentioned, J.M. DeMatteis before.
Mhm.
I happen to think that Tom DeFalco's run on Fantastic Four is very underrated. There was a craftsmanship. Whether you thought that the artwork was a little old fashioned, or you thought that Tom's writing was a little bit old fashioned, and but I read every issue, and I felt like you were getting your money's worth. You were getting a story in every issue, even though maybe some subplots carried over from issue to issue. You were getting a complete unit of entertainment for your money, and that's something that I think has really been lost over the years.
Oh yeah, I would agree. Well, I completely agree with you, and I also think, maybe he had the misfortune in some ways of coming in after some very hot runs, and that's always tough to do. But
yeah, it's tough to follow, and he followed Walt Simonson twice.
Yeah, exactly.
On Fantastic Four and Thor.
Yeah.
But I think that there is something to be said for the guys who've been around for a while. And I remember, I won't name names, but there was a point where Marvel had gone through its Image phase, and whoever the execs were, because there was a revolving door towards the end of the 90s, and whoever the execs were at that particular moment said, we're looking at these books, and we can't tell what the heck's going on from page to page and from panel to panel. This, we can't understand what these comic books are about. And the editor-in-chief at the time, who I would say was kind of responsible for the whole wave of Image artists who catapulted to popularity. That put the fear of God into him, and he came down. I remember I was hanging out after hours with one of the senior editors, and the editor-in-chief came in, and he said, we've got to put more emphasis on storytelling. We've got to find really great artists who can tell a story and not this flashy stuff. Now, I know that a lot of the older artists, or the more experienced artists, had kind of been phased out of Marvel under this guy's, reign. And I said to him, well, if that's the direction we're going in, then our most valuable asset at this point would be like Ron Frenz. I said, the guy is a brilliant storyteller.
Yep.
And you could see like the guy's eyes just kind of glazed over, like he couldn't argue with what I was saying, but he didn't value Ron Frenz because Ron Frenz was old-fashioned style to this guy, So he was like, yeah, but, and then he just kind of gave up and walked out of the office, because he didn't have an argument.
Yeah, that's sad to hear.
Yeah, no, that's awful. But
and I relished every opportunity I could to work with Ron Frenz. I mean, you could see it. You could see it if you look at the stuff that I edited back then. I mean, had Ron Frenz not accepted Spider-Man Hobgoblin Lives, which I edited, there wouldn't have been a Spider-Man Hobgoblin Lives because I didn't want to do it without him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the customers appreciated Ron Frenz as well. So
yeah.
And he's still brilliant. He's brilliant today. If you see his stuff, he posts his latest stuff on Facebook, and he's as good as he ever was.
A lot of these people are. I think there's, if we're talking about how some of the cultures have changed and some of the different direction, I mean, there's a lot of people who have, really great skill, same skill they had 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And they're giving away for free largely online now. I mean, if you bring them in.
Yeah. But I didn't mean to derail the topic. I don't remember where we left.
No, this is perfect. But since you brought up Spider-Man, you were there during the Clone Saga, and you played a part in that. One of the pieces in particular, I think, was the Osborne Journal. What was it like being there at Marvel during the Clone Saga, and what was it like contributing, something like the Osborne Journal to it?
Well, I was against the Clone Saga from the moment I heard about it. I felt, that's let sleeping dogs lie. Why dredge all that up? But I was not in the Spider-Man office at that time. This was something that was, sort of conveyed to me by one of my close friends who was in the Spider-Man office. And I was like, oh, really? You're going to go there? But whatever. You couldn't argue with the sales success that the Clone Saga brought to Spider-Man in those early days.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I later found myself in the Spider-Man group in an ancillary way. I was working on a lot of the side projects. Never the books that were sort of driving the engine, but whatever was going on in the main books, we would do spin-offs or sideline stuff, like Spider-Man: The Final Adventure, for example, or we did the Spider-Man annuals, that year, where we have to work in the fact that, okay, Ben Reilly is now the Scarlet Spider, and Peter and Mary Jane are going to have a baby and all that. So we pick up that continuity and do stories on the side streets, so to speak. The big thing that I'm actually proud to have worked on at that time was Untold Tales of Spider-Man, which was set so many years in the past that we didn't have to deal with the Clone Saga at all. And that was great, working with Kurt Busiek and Pat Olive and Al Vey and Al Williamson, and that was just fantastic.
Yeah.
But in terms of the Clone Saga, what happened was we knew we had to get out of it at one point, and there were two regime changes during the course of the Clone Saga. I won't go into all the details, but there was first the editor-in-chief left Marvel, and then another editor-in-chief came in and left. We were given different marching orders, and ultimately we had a whole roadmap as to how we were going to wrap this up. Originally, Ben Reilly was going to take on the Peter Parker identity, and that's we were going to move forward that way. Mm-hmm. That got shot down ultimately, and so it was going to be, okay, we're going to kill Ben Reilly. Peter Parker is going to come back as Spider-Man. He was the real guy all along, and we're going to have to deal with the baby somehow, and we'll figure that out. And the original plan was going to be, the original plan was going to be that Harry Osborne was alive all that time, and he was pulling all the strings. Okay. And that was the plan. And then what happened was a new editor-in-chief came in, and he told us we were going to wrap up the Clone Saga in April of 96. That was going to be the end point, April of 96. Harry was going to be revealed. We were going to wrap the whole thing up. Boom. And then the new editor-in-chief came in, and we told him our plans, and he said, well, you have to hold off for 6 months.
By time. Perfect.
And part of that was because Heroes Reborn was going to be happening, and we weren't supposed to know. He couldn't come out and tell us what was happening. He didn't want this to have to compete with Heroes Reborn. Okay, and Onslaught, right. all that Onslaught stuff. So anyway, we had to put everything on hold for 6 months. And the editor-in-chief hated the idea that Harry was behind it all, because he didn't think that Harry was ever he never had the stature and the imposing nature as the Green Goblin as his father did. So he ordered us to bring back Norman Osborn, who had been dead for about 23 years at that point. And so we had to change all of our plans and make it so that Norman Osborn was behind it all. Okay. Mm-hmm. Which all of us opposed. I mean, all of us were dead set against it. Yeah. And he could not be convinced otherwise. So once that became the case, Ralph Macchio, who had become the new Spider-Man editor, he knew I was, very up on my Spider-Man history. And so we were talking, and somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody had just put on the Marvel publishing schedule Spider-Man, the Goblin Journal, and didn't tell anybody what it was. But Ralph had to put this out, and he had no idea what the project was, but we were committed to publishing this thing. So we went out to lunch one day, and he mentioned, he goes, I'm supposed to do this Goblin Journals thing. I don't know what it is.
This
is great.
Yeah, this is great.
And it was going to come out after the Clone Saga was wrapped up, maybe a month or two after the Clone Saga wrapped up. And I said, well, all I can tell you, Ralph, is what I would do if I was in your shoes. And I said, what I would do is have the whole book be told from Norman Osborn's point of view. It's the journals that he's been keeping. And this way you get it from his perspective. I said, remember in Tomb of Dracula, where every few months Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan would do an entire issue of all these vignettes from Dracula's journal? And Ralph, who was a big Dracula fan, goes, yeah, I remember that. I said, that's what I would do. He was like, oh, okay, all right. You want to write it? And I said, no. I said, no, because the tide was turning against staffers doing freelance work at that point. It was considered to be, one of those things that should only be done on rare occasions, from that point on. And so I was uncomfortable. I was like, maybe not me. I said, you know who you should ask? Kurt Busiek, because Kurt has encyclopedic knowledge for all that kind of stuff. And, he was writing Untold Tales with Spider-Man. Anyway, he was knee deep in Spider-Man and Goblin history and all that. Well, Kurt turned him down. So I said, okay, if Kurt turned it down, then I feel comfortable taking it on as long as it's okay with the editor-in-chief. I don't think the editor-in-chief cared one way or the other. So, so that's how it came about. And I basically just sat down and thought about what's happened in Spider-Man basically since Gwen Stacy died. How do I rationalize how Norman's been alive all this time since we saw his dead body? How is he still alive? And how could he have manipulated basically 23 years worth of Spider-Man history? And how do I do this in 32 pages? And so I basically sat down and just said, what are the key points in Spider-Man's life that have happened, between Gwen's death and the Clone Saga? And what are those key points, and why would Norman either ignore them, or how could he have been behind them? So I think that one of the first things I started with was, if he was alive, why didn't he go after Spider-Man again right then and there? Mm-hmm. And so I came up with the rationale for that. How did he even allow the Hobgoblin to exist, for all those years, if he was still alive? I came up with a rationale, all that kind of stuff. I think I even suggest that he knew who the Hobgoblin was, the real Hobgoblin. I think I suggest, because I knew at that point we were going to be doing Hobgoblin Lives and wanted to plant some seeds for that. So I had a lot of fun with it. And all of that stuff was so fresh in my head, all the continuity, all the history, that I remember I sat down, I was on a city bus from one end of Brooklyn to the other. And I started writing an outline on the start of my trip. By the time I got home, 45 minutes later, I basically had the whole framework for the Osborne Journal. It just poured out of me. Nice. And I didn't even have any reference, materials in front of me. It was all from memory. And of course, when I actually started writing the book, I was able to go in and just confirm stuff. But that's how it all came together. It came together very smoothly, very easily. And basically, that framework served as what you ended up seeing in the printed comic book. Nice. With very few changes.
Very nice, which was a very different tonally. It's just a very different tone at the time. It is an interesting book.
Yeah.
It is.
On a bus.
I'm sorry?
Written on a bus. I think that's crazy. I love it.
What I would have loved to have done was be able to provide more than just a framing sequence, showing Norman writing in the journal, and on the last page is, he's getting ready to go after Peter at the end of the Clone Saga and say, tonight, Parker, tonight, it's Halloween, the night of Goblin. I would have liked to have been able to have more pages to actually have a story, around the journal. But the book ended up, because there was so much ground to cover, it really just is the journal. There's no framing story around it. And that's one of my, that's one of my regrets about it. But given the format, I couldn't have done it any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, since you brought it up, we might as well talk a little bit more of the Untold Tales of Spider-Man, which is getting another omnibus printing.
Is it really?
Yeah. Later this year, they're doing another one because it's still very popular.
It was great stuff.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah. Well, it is. I mean,
yeah.
And there's a timeless quality to it. I think it's some stories age out. Those don't.
Yeah. Well, what we tried to do, and this was, I would say it was Kurt, who really was the driving force to the approach, was we tried to make it so that if Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, was being published at the same time as the lead Ditko Amazing Spider-Man, what would it have been like? And that's the approach that we took. That Amazing Spider-Man is the A book, and all the main stuff happens there, but Untold Tales of Spider-Man, which again we approached it as Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man in the 60s, does like all this sideline stuff. So we came up with a lot of new characters and new villains. And if we used the pre-existing villains, we made sure that it worked very, very tightly with the continuity of that time, so we didn't contradict anything. And that was the approach that we took. So that by the time we got towards the end of the series, we were pretty much heading into the college years, and that's what we, had the book lasted, that's what we would have headed into, was the college years.
Yeah,
and we probably would have stayed there for a very long period of time.
Yeah, like the comics. Yeah,
like the comics did. Yeah,
he was in high school for like
3 years.
Yeah, about 3 years, and then in college for a lot longer than 3 years.
66 he entered college, and he graduated in 78, so 12 years.
Yeah.
But we would have like, we did that progress. We got him through the high school period. But for me, the college period was such a fertile ground for stories that, had the book continued, I would have pushed to just sort of like, put on the brakes and let's just stay in this era, for the foreseeable future. But it was great.
And do you have any other like favorite runs of Spider-Man that from back then or since, or
from when I was working at Marvel, or
before you were working at Marvel, or after?
Well, before I got to Marvel, I mean, obviously, the entire Stan Lee run, whether it was working with Ditko or Romita, I mean, that's the canon. I mean, that's the well from which everything springs.
Yeah.
I thought Jerry Conway was fantastic. I thought he knew Spider-Man like almost nobody else. The Roger Stern run was just, for me, I mean, that's the run that made me a regular Spider-Man reader. I came in at just the right time when Roger and John Romita Jr. were just firing on all cylinders. I would hold that as number 2 after Stan, after the entire Stan Lee run. Roger Stern is right up there, number 2. I am so proud to say that I was able to work with him as both an editor and as a co-writer, and I consider him a friend. And I wish I could go back in time and to talk to my 12-year-old self and say, you're going to be friends with this guy. This guy who you're going to the comic store every month and picking up his stuff. He's going to become a very important figure in your life. Same with J.M. DeMatteis, who it was fantastic Spider-Man writer, just great. Oh, yeah. I don't want to leave out Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz. They did a fantastic run. After I left, I think that oh boy, I'd have to remember what came after I left. I would say that boy, it's hard. I mean, you know what? I liked a lot of the stuff that was done after One More Day.
Yeah.
As
the rebuilding.
The rebuilding. I can say that, I hated the path that they took to get to that point. I'm not a big fan of the One More Day story. I'm also not a fan of a lot of the stuff that came right before One More Day.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to get into that.
Yeah, no.
But I think that a lot of the storylines that were done in the wake of the Brand New Day era, I enjoyed a lot of that. The stuff by Joe Kelly and Bob Gale, Mark Waid. Mark Waid was great. Some of the Dan Slott stuff, good stuff. Yeah.
It's funny. I think a lot of people have good memories of the Brand New Day material. Just like you, they hated how they got there, and it almost made it so that they couldn't quite enjoy it. But there was definitely good runs there. But like I wish they found a different path. But
I wish they found a different path. But if they were going to take that path, at least one of the things I wish they had done was undid that Sins Past, the Gwen Stacy Norman. I mean that to me is the absolute low point of Spider-Man, whether I was there or not there, or just across the history of that character. That to me is like a stain that still hasn't been removed, and I just wish somebody would come along and just sort of say, "Oh no, that was a dream," or "That was another Gwen clone." All that stuff. I really wish that they would just clean up that mess.
It was weird that they neglected to erase that when they had a perfect opportunity to do it. I don't know. I guess I should have asked you about Trouble. Were you a fan of that series?
That was after my period at Marvel. I did not. I am aware of it. I know what happens in it. I think that from the moment it came out, Marvel kind of distanced themselves from it, and it's not considered part of continuity.
Yeah,
so it in that respect, it did no harm.
That's true.
Yeah, and
better ground there than Trouble.
Yeah, and you've gotten to you've met Ditko at
I met him once. Right? Yeah, he's an interesting guy. I went up to him, and at the time, I didn't know a lot about his background and his philosophy and all that kind of stuff. He was always like a mysterious figure to me, So I didn't know that he just saw the world in his own sort of Ayn Randian way. And if you say the wrong thing to him, he would, or if you say something to him in a certain way, he will interpret it in a certain way. And, there were so many times when people would come up to the offices, whether it was Herb Trimpe or maybe Gil Kane or whomever. And I certainly remember going up to Herb Trimpe and saying, it's a real honor to meet you. You were such an important part of my childhood. Your Hulk is the Hulk that I first encountered. And he shook my hand. And he's like, "Oh, thanks a lot. That's very nice of you to say," that kind of thing. John Ostrander, when I first met him, same thing. I'm just a fan. I'm such a fan of your work. It's such an honor to meet you,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I did the same thing with Ditko. And I put out my hand and he took it and shook my hand. I said, it is such an honor to meet you. And I felt it was self-explanatory. You know what I mean? Steve Ditko, co-creator of Spider-Man, Doctor Strange. I wouldn't be in this business. I wouldn't be at this company if not for him. I figured it was self-explanatory. It's just an honor to meet him. And he just kind of looked at me like, with this kind of quizzical look, and he goes, "Why?" and I didn't know how to answer. I was flummoxed, and I was like, I just remember just getting away from there as quickly as I could because I didn't know what to say. He was like, "Why? Why is it an honor to meet me?" And I'm like, if I have to explain to you, I don't know how to do that.
There's no way for that conversation to go right.
But what about did you get to interact with Stan Lee at all in your time?
Very much so. Very much. Well, Stan, that convention that I told you about where I met all these people, that's where I met. Stan was my guest of honor that year. Oh, wow. So I literally handed Stan a check, when he came to this convention. And Stan wrote me, I asked Stan if he could write me a recommendation, and he did. He wrote me a very, very nice recommendation. Wow. When I wanted to get into the business. But Stan, when I took over, after Mark Gruenwald passed away, I took over as the editor of the Bullpen Bulletins page that appeared in all the Marvel comics at the time. And we brought Stan back to write Stan's Soapbox. So I was working with Stan on a regular basis, and when Stan wanted, to answer kids, readers' letters, so I would send the letters to Stan. I would pick out the letters for Stan and send them to Stan, and Stan would write the responses, and we talk every couple of weeks or so. Stan wrote for me. I was editing with Tom Brevoort the Spider-Man annuals for I think 1995 or 1996. We got Stan to write a story for us. So I worked with Stan. He sent me the plot. I sent him the art. He sent me the script, and there was a lot of back and forth, and it was great. And this is not a very well-known story because it's very behind the scenes, but Stan was originally going to write the book that became The Incredible Hulk versus Superman.
Oh, wow.
The Marvel DC crossover. Stan was the original writer on it. And so Stan and I had, quite a few conversations about what we wanted to accomplish, with the story and all that. Obviously, it didn't come about, and Roger Stern ended up writing it. But that time that I got to spend with Stan, I knew at the time, I said, remember as many details of this as you can, because this is you're talking to a living legend right now. And I wasn't recording it, but commit all this to memory, because this is going to be, some of the best moments of your life, and it was true. And he was great. And I'm happy to say I got to meet him many, many times, and I got to work with him. And he was great. He was funny. He didn't have a great memory. He sometimes called me Gary, Greg, anything but Glenn. And he would let his guard down at times, and you could see, he could be a little cantankerous. And you get caught in he would get caught in an embarrassing moment and bounce right back. I don't think this is a bad story, but it's a Stan story.
Yeah.
Certainly not as bad as what I'm hearing is in this new book that came out about him, by Abraham Reisman.
Oh, yeah.
I'm talking about. But
I've heard it.
This just to me.
Do you think there's value, by the way, in that these books come out and they want to kind of dredge up some of the dirt? At this point, is there any value in having that out? I mean, it's going to make money, but
as long as it's fair, as long as they're not tearing Stan down to elevate Kirby, Ditko, because you know what? They weren't angels either. And a lot of what Kirby said was just fundamentally not true, the claims that he made. And believe me, I am not going after Kirby. I have the utmost respect and admiration for him. I'm a Kirby fan. If you look at my bookshelf, you see a lot of Kirby stuff. But some of the stuff that he said about how he created the Hulk, I just know it's not accurate, So as long as it's even-handed, I can see there's a lot of interest in learning more about Stan. He is a living legend. Not living anymore, but he is a legend. And Kirby and Ditko and everybody, they are all owed their due.
Yes.
I just don't want to see Stan torn down to elevate other people who were just as guilty of gilding the lily, so to speak.
Yeah,
but anyway, my quick Stan story is, I was working with Stan at the time. It might have been on Hulk versus Superman, or it might have just been, the bullpen bulletins stuff. And there was a death at Marvel. A guy named Jack Abel had died. And he was an inker for many, many years. And he had become a proofreader at Marvel in his later years. He had a couple of strokes, so he couldn't draw anymore. But he was on staff as a proofreader, and unfortunately, he passed away. And I think it was his death, but we were all at the funeral, And Stan apparently was trying to reach us. I know he tried to call me. He tried to call a couple of other people at the office, and we were all at the funeral in the morning. So I have this voicemail on my phone from Stan. He goes, "Hey, Glenn, it's Stan. What the hell hours are you all keeping there? Where the hell is everybody? What's nobody showing up for work anymore? What the hell's going on there?"
No.
So I get back from the funeral, and this is what I'm hearing. So I call Stan's office, and again, he says, "Where the hell is everybody? I tried calling 3 or 4 people." I said, "Well, Stan, we were all at Jack Abel's funeral." And he went, I'm sorry to hear that. How the hell are you doing? How is everybody over there? How are you? He just completely switched into Stan mode. The Stan that you know and you love. Excelsior,
Yeah.
And just to hear that complete personality change, I had to cover the phone. I was laughing so hard, But that was Stan. That was Stan,
Yeah.
Stan, when we killed off Aunt May in Amazing Spider-Man number 400, we called him first. Our editor-in-chief of Spider-Man at the time, Bob Budiansky, called Stan to get his blessing. Stan knew all about it. We prepared him, And then when the backlash, came, Stan was like, I didn't know anything about it, but why the hell are they killing off Aunt May? She's such an important character. Stan he didn't want to offend anybody. He just wanted to be liked, and he didn't want any controversy. That's who he was. It's fine.
Yeah. I agree. It's a classic executive behavior, to be honest. Yeah. Just it's I do hope the book is fair. I don't know. I look at this and I can't help but feel it's going to be a lot of just kind of scandal bait kind of thing.
I think I get that sense too, unfortunately.
Now, you did do some work for DC as well.
I did. I did stuff for their online division. Mm-hmm. A lot of writing for. They did a year-long website to tie in with their 52 weekly series. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so we were doing like news pieces and articles and in character. So I had to like write this stuff in character. Following along the events of what was going on in 52. So if that week's issue was very heavy on Booster Gold, I had to like take the events of the story and write like an article about whatever Booster Gold got trouble he was in for that issue, and the next issue would be like Detective Chimp, or whatever. Yeah. So I was doing that, and that I parlayed that into doing some online stuff, tying in with Superman Returns. So, for example, I was writing these blog entries as Lois Lane.
Oh, nice. Okay.
To sort of set up, the status quo of Superman Returns. Like, so Superman's been missing for 5 years, she's come to the conclusion that the world doesn't really need him, Yeah. And how society has moved on past Superman. So I was doing stuff like that.
Oh, really nice. It was such a good cross marketing.
Nice. Yeah, it was fun. It was, it was early. It was early on in the internet, kind of exclusive online content for cross promotion with DC. So that was I did that for about, I'd say about six months, almost a year.
Yes.
Yeah.
How it's a very small vantage point into the company, but were there some kind of big cultural differences you saw between the two, or?
Oh yeah. DC was very uptight, very uptight. Yeah. And very, I don't want to say bunker mentality, but just, there was a sense that people didn't feel that they were free to talk openly or share information, or they took it very, very seriously, to the point where it's sort of like, we're not curing cancer here, it's it's like, and it's like, I understand you don't want the competition to find out what you're doing, but that's not the kind of stuff that I'm even referring to here. Those kinds of stuff. It's sort of like, being overly guarded. And I felt like it was, comparing that to Marvel, where again, we didn't just blurt things out and reveal stuff, but there was just a real sort of like an uptight feeling at DC whenever I visited the offices. It wasn't as warm and welcoming and comfortable as the Marvel environment. But I will say, I don't know what DC's like now, because all of the people that were there at that time when I was interacting with DC, none of them are there anymore.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and I gotta imagine Marvel's quite a bit different too at this point.
Oh yeah. I would think so. Marvel, I mean, freelancers could show up at Marvel and visit like for a full day, and they could go from office to office, interacting with the editors and saying, hey, looking for work, and I'm looking for work. Do you have anything? That's the way it was back then. I don't think it's that way now.
No, I hear it's definitely not.
No, you were also there when Heroes Reborn and all that was going on, and you did work on, what was it, the Avengers when Kurt took it over. After that, So what was it like? What was it like being there for Heroes Reborn and then editing on the Avengers?
Well, Heroes Reborn was a real slap in the face to editorial, because we had been doing. I can't even say we. I mean, I have to say Ralph Macchio was doing a great job turning the Avengers and Captain America around at the time when Heroes Reborn was going to take place. I mean, Ralph was the one who put Mark Waid and Ron Garney on Captain America.
Yeah.
And Mark Waid was taking over the Avengers too. I can't remember where Iron Man was at that point, but I remember that Fantastic Four had Carlos Pacheco was drawing the book towards the end. Although I think Tom DeFalco was still writing it. So we were trying to sort of change course and get the books more attention and elevate the quality and all that at the time that Heroes Reborn happened. So after that year, we were getting those characters back, and with Heroes Return, we knew, having those books, having had such high-profile creators working on them, whether it was Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee, and Walt Simonson was brought in to write the last few issues of, I think it was the Avengers and all that. So we knew we had a high standard that we had to live up to. And Ralph Macchio, again, I keep mentioning his name, but he was instrumental in bringing us George Perez. He had been talking to George, and he was saying to George, George, you would be so great on the Avengers at this point, but you have to commit to it. You can't take on 5 different projects at the same time and try to do them all. You have to commit, because that's that's ultimately what sank the art on the Infinity Gauntlet. That's why George couldn't finish it, because he was overcommitted.
Yeah.
So Ron Lim did a terrific job on his half of the Infinity Gauntlet, but let's look back. You take that book off your shelf. Don't you want to read? Don't you want to read it with one artist doing the whole 6 issues? Right?
Oh, absolutely.
It was a shame, because today it's pretty common now that events are multiple artists, and that's becoming more standard. But I remember the Infinity Gauntlet. I remember that switch, and I like you. I love Ron Lim. I think he does an amazing job. But I hated that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was a shame. So Ralph really kind of coached George, and the book was handed, to us, to me and Brevoort, or Brevoort is the editor, me as the assistant editor, and Kurt took, if I remember correctly, Kurt Busiek took on Avengers if he could have Iron Man. He really wanted Iron Man. And he took on the Avengers with George, because George wanted Kurt, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And Kurt said, "Okay, I'll do Avengers, which I don't want as much as Iron Man." So that's how he got those assignments. It was great. Kurt came to New York at one point to hash out what the first few issues were going to be like, and we went out to dinner and we hashed it out over a few hours. I served as assistant editor on, I think, the first 3 or 4 issues. And then I got promoted, and so I moved out of Brevoort's office, and I was editing my solely my own books at that point. So I was there for that. We were supposed to edit Iron Man with Kurt and Sean Chen. That got moved into Bobby Chase's office, but we did launch Thor by Dan Jurgens and John Romita Jr.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, I think I'm the one who suggested get Dan Jurgens for Thor, because I thought Dan Jurgens was one of the best Superman writers of that era. And I said, if he can do Superman, he can do a hell of a job on Thor. So I think I had suggested him for Thor. So I'm going to take credit for that.
It was a good run. That was a good choice.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also going to take credit for Pat Olive on Untold Tales of Spider-Man.
Nice.
I don't want to be a credit hog, but those are my two. Those are my two picks that I'm proudest of. Were those two. So when Heroes Return happened, Peter David wrote the miniseries, and that spawned the books. And I will say, I was at the meeting where we brought in as many of the creators as we could for who's going to take over, those books once we got them back. And I'll tell you, Mark Waid impressed me so much. It might have been one of the first times I ever met Mark. And instead of being bitter about, his Captain America run being, cut short, and them giving the books over to Rob Liefeld, and being resentful and just sort of like dismissing that whole run, which would have been very, very easy to do. Mm-hmm. Mark Waid at this meeting said, "Is there anything we like from the Liefeld run that we want to acknowledge, that we want to keep, that we want to play more with?" He wasn't coming in to just ignore everything that had happened before him, or after him, or before him coming back. He was more than willing. And I think the feedback that he got at the meeting was, just do what you want. Just do what you feel is right. You can pick up where you left off. You could just start anew. I don't think that anybody said no. You can't touch anything that Rob did. But I think maybe the sense was, well, we want to separate this from the Heroes Reborn stuff. So maybe just, stick to pure Cap, Marvel Universe Cap, and just go forward. And I just remember being thoroughly impressed, because it would have been just easy for him to not put that on the table.
Yeah, that's a stand-up move. Yeah. I mean, and you're right. It would have been easy for him to do that, because that, I think, more than the other titles, as I recall, my memory may be bad here, but the Garney Waid run on Captain America going into Heroes Reborn was the one probably that had the most buzz.
It did.
Yeah, just the creative team was locked in, and fans were probably most outraged about that one, because it was interrupting what they thought was, turning out to be a pretty good run. So he would have had every opportunity to basically come in and say, well, looks like I was right, and now, do what I want. So that's cool to hear. Waid has a lot of stories, of course, about him over the years, and I think that's a good stand-up one people should remember. So yeah. I mean, it's a funny moment, because it is going into Heroes Reborn. The world wasn't a weird place. I mean, at the Avengers at the time, we had the Wasp was an actual wasp, and it did give. I mean, the nice part about it is it did allow people to kind of brush some of that stuff under the rug, and that it's funny. That second time I think I heard that story that Busiek wanted Iron Man, and Avengers was kind of the gimme along with it, and it turned out that run he did on Avengers was beloved at this point. So
it was I my only regret is that I couldn't have been part of it for longer. It was I would have loved to have had my name as assistant editor on a bunch of more issues of that run. It was really great. He and George worked really, really well together, and it was a good long run too. I mean, George stuck it out, and I was really impressed with that. It was definitely things worked out for the best, and I think that those books were given, they were given a shot in the arm, and were given a sort of prominence that they might not have otherwise gotten.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, the sales definitely went up during that time period, but it also, it felt like by the end of it, people were also happy to turn the page as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I want to ask you a question. It's going to sound like a really stupid one, but I asked Joe the same question because, of course, he edits books, and so please forgive this dumb question, but it's a lot. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what an editor actually does, and if you go just to base it, fans, people in the shop, you'll hear a million answers to this question. I want you to explain everything an editor does, but what, during the course of getting a book ready to go out the door and putting that together, what are the things you're worried about?
Well, first and foremost, the editor's job is to supervise the creative team. And a lot of times that means putting together the creative team. Yeah. And ideally, if you're a good editor and you're doing your job well, you pick the right people for the right job, and you get out of their way, and you let them do their jobs, and you trust them, and that means you're able to focus on the more technical stuff. First and foremost, the schedule. Yeah. I mean, editors rise and fall based on the schedule. I mean, that's what was drilled into us. At least this was the way it was when I was there. I don't quite know. I think that, the structure at Marvel has changed since I left, but the editors had a lot more autonomy when I was there. And so, I would come in, if I took over a book with a pre-existing team, I would, get a sense of where they are. I would think about where I wanted to take things. And if we are compatible and we're on the same page, great. If not, I talk to the creative team and I say, this is where I think we should go. And if they don't agree, then maybe we have to come to a parting of the ways. If they can't get their work in on time, maybe we have to come to a parting of the ways. It's tough. It's getting rid of people is probably, it should be the toughest job that an editor has to do, because you are depriving somebody of their pay. It was not easy. Luckily, I didn't have to do it too often. But a lot of it is the way Stan explained the job of an editor is, you're not just an editor, you're not just a traffic manager, you're also the art director. It's up to you to decide what the cover is going to look like. Talk to the cover artist. You interface with the art director. You make sure that everything is coming in on time. You check in with your creative team, see how they're doing. Make sure they're going to meet their schedules. You work with the production department. If you're going to be late, you work with them to see how you can address that problem and get around it, so that the printers aren't waiting too long, that the company doesn't incur fees for holding up the printing press and all that kind of stuff. For me, and a lot of times, you have to see yourself as the caretaker of those characters. Mm-hmm. You have to think about long term. The writer and the artist that's doing your book at that point isn't always going to be there. If they do something that negatively impacts those characters, that's on you. Right. So whether you have, I'm thinking back. If a writer tries to slip in a curse word, or some kind of sexual innuendo, you have to be on the lookout for that and make sure that, either it's removed or it's so subtle that nobody's going to get it, or you have plausible deniability, that kind of thing. But you have to protect the characters and you have to protect their future prospects. So, you have to shut down, I'm thinking about, and this is all public knowledge, it's all been in interviews and such, there was a point where Bill Mantlo, I'm sure you know of Bill Mantlo. There was a point where Bill Mantlo wanted, Peter Parker, I think, if I remember correctly, he wanted Peter Parker to, have a child out of wedlock. Yeah. And Jim Shooter shot it down, and Mantlo was talking about, well, his creative rights were being, suppressed, and it's like, no, you can't have that. Yeah. Bill, you're only writing the character for now. We have to think about the long-term prospects of this. This is a going concern. So stuff like that. I never really. I mean, the people that I work with were mature enough and professional enough that they never put me in a spot where I had to shut down an entire storyline. I mean, the most that I would do is, I would call the writer and say, you know what, I think anybody who's reading, this character for the first time is not going to get what we're really referring to here. So can you clarify this in the dialogue? Can you be more clear in your storytelling? Can you be more informative in terms of the backstory? That was a benefit to me with a character that I wasn't, that I didn't have a lot of historical background on. So, for example, I worked with Doug Mensch on Moon Knight. I think I worked on the last project that Doug wrote for Moon Knight. And he was the creator of Moon Knight. So that's kind of a feather in my cap to say I edited the last Doug Mensch Moon Knight story.
Yeah.
But
it is.
there are a couple of points where I felt like, you know what, I'm not 100% sure on this, which means that a new reader is not going to be 100% sure on this. So I pushed Doug to be a little bit more clear and more devote a little bit more time to maybe establishing a little bit more of like the backstory or the history or just clarifying the points that he's trying to make. Stuff like that. That to me, I think, really sort of encapsulates what the editor should be doing.
I appreciate that. I think it seems to be a very misunderstood role. And what really resonated me with what you just said is I think it's the thing that maybe gets overlooked. I don't know. You've got a lot of competition from indies and people who are able to do their own creator-owned work. And so they do have complete control, and that creative vision in that scenario can play out. But when you're writing for the big two, like you said, you are going to leave the book at some point. Other people are going to come in. You've got a franchise to think about. It's a different beast. And I really appreciate that part of the editor's job is to make sure that it's protected as a property.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get the sense that nowadays the editor-in-chief tends to make, a lot of those decisions. And that the editors probably have a little less leeway and a little less say. I felt very liberated to the point where, there was a point on one of my books where, I just did not like the story that the writer turned in, and I basically just sat down, and I won't say that I rewrote it, because I didn't rewrite it, but I actually called the writer, and we went out to lunch, and I said, I can't make heads or tails out of this. And I said, I think it needs to be this, 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 and this. And he pushed back, and I said, but look, I'm going for a particular thing on this book. I want this to be one of the most readable books that Marvel puts out. I said, we are getting so much flack that our books are just incomprehensible and so dense and so non-new reader friendly. And I said, I don't want any of my books to be that way.
Yeah.
And he was rankled a little bit, and he was, he wasn't happy about it. But then it got back to me that he went to the editor-in-chief, who was one of his best friends, and he said, wow, Glenn's a really strong editor. Glenn's a really good editor. And it got back to me, and I was like, wow, I figured he would like bitch and moan to the editor-in-chief, right? But he saw, I guess he saw what I was doing, and he was impressed enough as to what I was trying to accomplish. But that I don't know if the editors at Marvel, or at least the junior editors, have that kind of license and that kind of agency now.
You kind of feel now, but it's hard to speculate. But it feels like the culture shifted a little bit. But what you're describing sounds like, I guess it reinforces the point you made a while ago. It's that's a good culture. If you can take that kind of stand to protect the property, maybe you're offending a writer, or maybe the writer doesn't particularly like it, but the writer then compliments you for it because you're doing the right job. That's a good culture. Yeah.
I was very flattered to hear that, to have that, when that came back to me. So yeah. And I get the sense that maybe the previous editor that he had been working with had never had that kind of conversation with him.
Yeah.
And as someone who was there for the Clone Saga and Heroes Reborn, are you excited that they're doing the Clone Saga and Heroes Reborn again, like weeks or months apart from each other this year?
This is, I don't know anything about it. I'm leery, but you know what? These things are so cyclical. They really are. We did our Clone Saga 20 years after the original Clone Saga wrapped up. So it's been 20 years, and they've already brought Ben Reilly back. I never thought they were going to bring Ben Reilly back.
Yeah.
And I don't know where he is. I don't know if he's dead or if he's the Scarlet Spider again, or I have no idea where he is.
Las Vegas, I think, somewhere.
Oh, he's in Las Vegas. Okay, all right. Well,
Yeah.
But it's like they did Secret Wars again. They did. That's the thing that what's his name did. Jonathan Hickman did a new Secret Wars and Heroes Reborn. I have no idea what any of that's about, but I guess it was due for it was due time that they would at least reuse that name. I know that the Secret Wars that Hickman did had nothing to do with the original Secret Wars,
right?
And the Secret War that Brian Michael Bendis wrote had nothing to do with the original Secret Wars. So I don't know whether this has to do with they're just reusing the title or they're literally.
No, it feels like just a title. It's a Squadron Supreme centered event. Which of course had nothing to do with the original one, but we'll see. It is. It's funny to see this stuff coming back. Particularly, because now we're into this era where I was selling these comics, so it was originally. So it's weird to see it return.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, and DC, how many times have they reused Crisis? They reused the Crisis title, over the last bunch of years. I actually think, unfortunately, I think one of the biggest disappointments that I've had with Marvel over the last few years is, and I have a lot of criticism that I could aim at J. Michael Straczynski, but I was really enjoying his take on the Squadron Supreme. Yeah. And he left right in the middle of a storyline. He left on a cliffhanger and never finished it. But I really liked what he was doing. And I would have loved to have seen more of that. So if they were doing like a Heroes Reborn event based on Straczynski's Squadron Supreme and he was actually writing it, I would be all for that. I would be in great support of that. I don't remember if he was doing that stuff before The Boys came along. The one that Garth Ennis did.
Oh yeah, I believe that predated it. Yeah,
I thought it was great.
I did too. I would like to see a return to that. This is the Squadron Supreme or Evil and Agents of Mephisto. So
I don't know anything about it. Yeah. I don't know anything about it. My feeling at the time we wrapped up the Clone Saga was let's never touch this again. Mm-hmm. The cynical part of me thinks that, if they had some great ideas for Spider-Man these days, they wouldn't have to touch it again. Yeah. But I don't want to slam them. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they feel strong enough about this that they're going back to that well. And who knows? Maybe it's not the Clone Saga as that maybe it doesn't have a lot to do with the Clone Saga that we did. I certainly hope not.
I don't think so.
Like it. It's more Miles Morales centered, and it's.
Oh, okay. Well,
it seems more in name. I do think you hit on something though. It feels like they're burning through these ideas faster, or because there are some good things going on in these titles, but there's the pace seems to be a very impatient pace at this point, where it's like you just got to throw it out faster and faster, and we are on the cycle now where you have at least 3 events a year at this point. So
well, it's funny because I just read I just finished reading a recent storyline. I fell way behind and I'm starting to catch up, and I just read a storyline that was 16 parts, and I felt it meandered. I felt there was so much padding, and I just saw, I haven't read it, but I just saw that there's this X-Men event that was 22 parts, And I was talking to somebody recently, and I just said, Watchmen was only 12 parts. Yeah. I think it did pretty well for itself. If you're going to have a 16-part story, there better be 16 issues worth of story there. Yeah. You're living in the shadow of Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns. Those books didn't need 16, 22 issues to tell their story. And the fact that I felt like so much of that storyline that I read was so padded. There's another, I don't want to name names. I don't want to throw anybody on the bus. But there was another story. There was a big event storyline from a few years ago that I just felt, could have been done in 6 issues. And I think it was done in 16, It's just too much. Padding.
It is. It's people criticize the 90s for excess, and there certainly was plenty of that, but we've had some events in recent years where, all told, with the core event and the tie-ins and everything else, you were well over 100 issues worth of event.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, nobody's buying all that. That's the thing. Yeah, we'll have to check back in after you've read that 22-part X event and see what you think.
Oh, that's not going to happen. Yeah, no, that is not going to happen.
You know, but I mean, just kind of maybe to reinforce your point too, like you mentioned earlier, you do have Marvel putting out movies that are pretty good quality. I mean, at least the box office thinks so.
Yeah.
And these are where they're telling these stories in 2 hours or 3 hours. And so if you're able to pull it off there, then this idea of a decompressed 16, 22 or longer comic storyline is going to play out over multiple months. It doesn't feel like it's a fair pairing at that point.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, I don't know whether it's true or not. I would love to be in a position where I could call for this kind of experiment, which is put the brakes on the books in terms of the status quo, you know?
Yeah.
Tell shorter storylines. Occasionally tell one-parters, you know? And just see what the reaction is amongst the audience. You know, this idea that everything has to be a 6-part storyline and the status quo has to change, you know, with each thing. That's not how it used to be done. That's how you had 50 to 60 years of Batman stories where nothing changed. He had his status quo, and the biggest status. There were 2 major status quo changes to Batman in the first 40 years. Okay, one was the introduction of Robin, and the second one was Robin goes off to college.
Yeah.
In 40 years, those were the 2 major status quo changes in Batman. You know, most of the stories were done in 1 part, maybe 2 parts, you know, and there wasn't this need to sort of make it like a soap opera on television or any kind of television series where you have to account for the actors are getting older, you know.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Put the brakes on. Keep the status quo as is for a while. Will the audience accept it? I don't know, but I'd love to find out. You know?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of evidence they would. I think there's been times where you've seen this a couple times. I mean, Hickman is experimenting with a one and done stuff in X-Men right now.
Okay.
And that is their highest selling book of the X line. And it feels like the audience is still ready for it, but it also feels like there's this built-in kind of almost, no, but whatever we do, we have to get back to the event. We have to get back to the world will never be the same again after this issue. You've got to buy it. But it doesn't feel like that works with the audience anymore.
Well, because, you know, you twist and you turn and you get all these different permutations to the point where the character no longer resembles the core concept, you know? Now, I have fallen behind in Spider-Man, for example. I don't know where Spider-Man is right now. The last Spider-Man that I read was Dan Slott's last issue.
Yeah.
And I felt he left Spider-Man in a good place. As far as I'm concerned, as long as Spider-Man is still young, I'm talking about Peter Parker, as long as he's still young and single and dealing with financial problems and struggling to, you know, find work and all that kind of stuff, and Spider-Man's life is a mess and Peter's life isn't much better, and if things are going well for Spider-Man, they've got to go bad for Peter. As long as that's still being done, the status quo is in a good place. I assume he's not married or engaged to anybody at this point.
No, he's dating MJ again.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, the problem that I have with, like, say, and I mentioned earlier, he's my favorite character, is the Hulk. They've changed him so much over the last 20, 25 years that he's gotten so far from where he should be, in my opinion. Now, in all fairness, I have not read Al Ewing's run yet. I hear it's terrific, and I am just about to start reading it, and I'm very much looking forward to reading because I've heard such great word of mouth. But, you know, I trace it all back to that moment when Bill Mantlo, I guess it was Hulk number 273 back in 1983 or so, had Banner take over the Hulk's body, so that Banner was fully in charge. We've never had the Hulk back to that status quo since on a regular basis. That was the last we ever saw of the traditional Hulk that everybody knows and loves. Hulk will smash. Why do humans bother Hulk? All Hulk wants is to be left alone, and all that kind of stuff.
I'm curious. Yeah, I'll be curious what you think of that. His run. This is, I think, not a popular opinion on Ewing's run, but it reminds me a lot more of the '70s, and he's doing something different, but he's also tapping into, I think, a lot of the core of the character, and I think that's well received.
And I would say that Peter. Don't get me wrong. Peter David's run was fantastic. I am very much an admirer of I would say 85% of what Peter did. But even he sometimes twisted and changed the concept a little too far for me. I thought that Greg Pak did a terrific job, sort of starting to put all the pieces together, again. And then they went in another direction after Greg Pak. So I just feel that, I would love to see, the status quo sort of stick around for a while. And I don't know if you have to keep doing these events one after another, these major storylines where things keep changing and changing and changing and changing. Give it a rest. Just tell great stories with the status quo that you've got, and stick with it for a while and see what happens. There's no, you can burn through so many stories if you keep changing things. Try to come up with some great stories. You don't have to, like, for example, my big problem with Superman over the last 20 years is they keep going back and retelling the origin and changing it. And it's like, no, you don't have to change anything that John Byrne did. You don't have to. Those are all cosmetic things. Just tell good Superman stories. They're still out there. Just tell them. You don't have to change everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, if you're constantly shifting it around, if you're constantly remolding the character, you're not left with anything. I mean, it's just loose clay at that point. It makes it tough. I'm curious, like I said, what you'll think of the Ewing run. I do think he's bringing horror into the mix, but a lot of the early Hulk had that kind of feel to it. It's just they didn't lean into the horror aspect as much.
Right, because they didn't know Stan and Jack didn't know what to do with the Hulk for those first 6 issues. When I was writing the Hulk, I wanted to move the series into more of a horror feel, and I didn't. That project didn't last long enough for it to happen. But I was moving in that direction. And I had a whole storyline mapped out that I was going to do right before the rug got pulled under us. So I'm really excited because one of Peter David's first stories on the Hulk was a horror story, sort of like a Nightmare on Elm Street kind of thing. Yeah. And I loved it. And I think the Hulk works really well in a horror milieu.
Yeah. I think you're going to really like it then. So
great.
So if you could, what you're to come back and they say, okay, pick your book. What book would you go to?
If I could go back to Marvel and pick any book to write?
Anything you want.
Oh boy! Well, if Al Ewing wraps up his Hulk run, I would like another shot at the Hulk because I didn't feel like I really was able to sink my teeth into him enough. I'd like to get another shot at the Hulk.
He is wrapping up his run, so there you go. We'll have to figure.
Sorry,
I think he is wrapping up his run, so this is good. We should line that up.
And another character that I was able to play with for a short period of time. I would have loved to have done more with him. I would love to do more with him is the Marvel version of Dracula.
Yeah.
But I would have to change him back to what he was originally. I don't know who this guy is now, with running around with the long hair and the armor and the sword. I don't know what that is.
Dracula's in a very confusing place right now. I think he's showing up in the Avengers, and he's kind of a Russian agent at the moment. It's a very strange.
Yeah, I would. No offense to the people who are doing stuff with him now, but I would take him back to the core character from the Tomb of Dracula that Marv Wolfman wrote, which is what I tried to do when I wrote him. I would love to get a crack at the Star Wars comics, but those aren't Marvel characters.
True.
But yeah, Hulk, Dracula. If I had the opportunity to do more with Spider-Man, I'd love to play with him. I only ever wrote a married Spider-Man, so
that's true.
Except for the issues of Untold Tales of Spider-Man that I co-wrote, with Kurt. But I never got to write like, single Spider-Man, in the present day. And that would be interesting to do, I think.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All things considered, you got a lot of good memories of your time. You wouldn't trade it in?
Well, no, absolutely not. You go from job to job, and there are some jobs where you never talk to the people that you worked with again. You never see them, you never interact with them again. Some of my closest friends to this day are the friends that I made at Marvel. I met my wife because of one of the friends that I had at Marvel, So, so much of my life, so much of my career, so much of who I am was shaped by my time at Marvel. I wouldn't trade it for the world. I had so many good experiences, so many good memories. They certainly outweigh the bad.
That's awesome. Not everybody has a happy ending in comics. So I'm glad it's good memories for you. And yeah, you brought some great stuff.
Thanks. It's and like I said, I still have a lot of friends, from that company, and I still have friends who are still at that company. I was actually able to do some work for Marvel again over the last few years. Nothing really high profile, but I was working for Marvel again. It was paying the bills, and I got to contribute some text pieces to some of the Star Wars comics, which was a lot of fun. Thank you, Mark Panicia. I always feel like there's still a connection at Marvel. It just needs the right moment and the right person to just sort of plug it back in. And I would be happy to work there, work for those guys again whenever they'd be interested.
Awesome. Well, I hope we get to see more stuff that you've done there. It's you gave me a lot of good memories, so I'm
oh, good.
I'd love to see more work that you do.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Joe, anything else before you wrap up?
Yeah, no, this is great. It's been a while since I got to chat with Glenn. I've chatted with him at shops before, run into him, and we worked briefly together on the Planned Parenthood anthology, the Mine anthology, that was a lot of fun. We got to do a signing at Forbidden Planet together for that, and
nice.
It was Denny O'Neil was there.
Yep.
It was one of the last times I saw him.
It was the last time I saw him.
Yeah, it's a shame, but yeah, no, this was great. Anyone who's listening to this, if you're inspired to pick up the Untold Tales of Spider-Man omnibus now that it's coming back in print in a couple of months,
I believe in June, right? It's
I think about June. So you might be able to pre-order it already, or if not, like check it out. It's really great stuff.
And pick up mine.
Yes, pick up the Mine anthology, please. It's still available.
I'm so proud of that. I'm so proud of that book. I'm so proud of the acclaim and the award that it got.
Yeah,
I'm very proud to have been a part of that. As is my partner Nick Guaricino, who is my artist on my story. We're very proud to have been part of that.
Thank you so much. It was great. We'll have to figure out doing something again sometime.
I'm here.
Awesome.
If I could just mention a project that's out now,
yes,
and a couple of projects that are upcoming. On sale now, you can get it through Amazon, is my book about John Lennon, which is, if you go to Amazon and you type in John Lennon and Bauer Publishing, Bauer, you will be taken to what's called a bookazine. And it was done in conjunction with the 80th anniversary of his birth, and unfortunately the 40th anniversary of his death. But it is a book, a 100-page publication that covers his entire life and his career, including the Beatles and his life after the Beatles. And it's updated to up to the present day. Very proud of it, and that's available through Amazon. My next project is for the same publisher. It's a history of Star Trek, primarily the original series, in conjunction with the 100th birthday of Gene Roddenberry, and the 90th birthday of both William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. And so it takes you from the earliest days of Star Trek up to pretty much the present day, with an emphasis on the original series. and I am working on another project now about the history of Marvel. So,
great.
So Star Trek isn't. I don't have a pub date yet for that, but I'll let you guys know. And the Marvel project is further down the line. I'll let guys know about that. But right now, the one thing I really want to push is John Lennon.
Well, absolutely. So if you're listening to this right now, look at the description, whether it's on the podcast or it's YouTube, wherever you are, and you'll see there'll be a link directly to this book, so you can go check it out. Great. And then when the other projects that Glenn's mentioning, when those do come up, I'll update the description. So you can then, if you're hearing this later, you can go in and route to it. But I hope that when you do the Marvel book or your Star Trek book, frankly, if you have the time, I'd love to have you back on and chat about that specific project.
Oh, I'd love to. I would love to. I'm very proud of how these came out. Especially, I mean, the Star Trek book, I was able to do an exclusive interview with George Takei.
Oh, wow.
Okay, excellent.
So, and I was actually able to use part of an interview that I had done with Gary Lockwood, the actor, who appeared in the second pilot as Gary Mitchell, the godlike being who tries to take over the Enterprise and kill Kirk.
Oh, wow.
So he was terrific. So so I'm really, really happy with the Star Trek book. Would be thrilled to come back and talk to you guys about that and the Marvel book as well.
Well,
awesome.
We'll definitely have to talk again. Glenn, thank you so much for all the time, and I love hearing these stories, and I could listen to hours more of them.
Yes.
I just need some water and I could talk some more.
Yeah. God, but yeah.
We'll definitely go ahead. Joe, thank you as well. And I hope everybody who's listening had a great time, as much fun as I did having the conversation. And we'll talk to both of you again really soon.
All right.
Awesome. Yeah.